Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I am here with my friend and former advisor, still mentor, Philip Clayton. And we're going to get to talk about a theological giant, Jürgen Moltmann. And one of the things about him is that his biography is as compelling as his theology. And when you think of what it means to be a theologian, there's hardly anyone in the post-war world who exemplifies what it's like to serve a church in front of the horror and on behalf of a God. He refuses to be something less than love. And with his passing, we're going to spend some time sharing some stories, some of his big ideas, and doing something that Jürgen Moltmann insisted on. Unlike you could say his theological conversation partner and opponent, and Wolfhart Pannenberg, who Phil studied with, he didn't write a systematic theology. He wrote explorations, and thought that the task of theology is something no one person should do completely. And so he wanted to make contributions in receiving the big questions of Christianity in times and in context. And that's what he's speaking to. And so there's nothing more appropriate to honor someone like Moltmann than to take his ideas seriously and explore them just as that, explorations and not final words about something. So, Phil, thank you so much for being here. And since we're having a little fun for Moltmann, he gets the air horn. Oh yeah. There we go. So, Phil, thank you for joining.
It's been amazing to see the passion and the amount of outpouring of grief and appreciation of Jürgen Moltmann since he passed away on Monday, June 3rd. The statements from many sources, people who are close to him, coming out, tributes. And I think, after 98 years, we've known his theology since the 60s. They've been some of the most influential theological books. In fact, for 10 years, Theology of Hope was the highest selling theological book after it appeared. And with this perspective, though, suddenly coming back, he's been still productive, still speaking. Even 3 weeks ago, he was preparing a talk. And now we have a perspective, and people were ready to appreciate his place, his influence on theology and in history since he did it. There's a little strangeness that I would be there. Moltmann and Pannenberg were the forces when I was studying in Germany. My closest theological friend was a guy named Miroslav Wolf. He was in Tübingen as a doctoral student of Miroslav. I was in Munich as a doctoral student of Pannenberg. We'd get together 2 times a year, once in each place, same number of hours with our families, and have incessant debates as this stuff was emerging. And Miroslav deepened himself in the Moltmann framework. I deepened myself in the Pannenberg framework. But for both of us, after the decades have gone by, it's a lot easier to see the particular role that both played. And so I want to bring Miroslav Wolf's words here right at the beginning. He published a tribute yesterday through his Yale Center, saying the great attraction of Moltmann's theology is that it remained fresh, close to the pulse of life. He wrote about things that move people, about suffering and joy, about exploitation, discrimination, and solidarity, about the travails of God's creatures under human greed, about life and death. And he wrote about life by exploring the greatest themes of Christian faith: God, Christ, Spirit, creation, redemption, and new creation. I can't think of 2 sentences that say that more powerfully than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When we had originally planned to do a little fun, like developing the doctrine of God before his passing, and I'm like, it would be, we can always talk about God, but as people are discovering, rediscovering, and remembering a theologian like Moltmann, I thought we should leverage this time to get to wrestle with this thought. And one of the passages of Moltmann about what the task of the theologian is, that has been at the top of a host of syllabus when I write them, and that I think gets him. And here's what he said the task of the theologian is. It is simple but true to say that theology has but one problem: God. We are theologians for the sake of God. God is our dignity. God is our agony. God is our hope. For me, theology springs from a divine passion. That is the open wound of God in one's own life and the tormented men, women, and children of this world. But for me, theology also springs from God's love for life, the love for life which we experience in the presence of the life-giving Spirit, which enables us to move beyond our resignation and begin to love here and now. There are also Christ's two experiences of God. Because of that, they are the foundation of theology, God's deep delight and God's pain. Oh, yeah.
That ties so closely with his own personal experience. I love the way that in describing it, he said when he was as a prisoner of war, and he was given a Bible in Scotland and started to read it. He doesn't speak of it as a conversion moment, but it was more God found me. He also describes, I don't know if he describes his experience being on a German-Polish commission in 1962 and traveling to a concentration camp in Poland, a place where 10,000 Jews were killed in a single day, and feeling a level of shame and disgust where he thought he just couldn't keep walking, knowing that everybody there looked at him as a representative of the group that did that. And then he had this incredible vision where he suddenly saw heaven and saw these 10,000 people coming toward him from that place of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of redemption. And I believe that 1962 vision really was the core of everything that Moltmann did from then until he died last Monday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that just in, going back and forth as to how to even organize this, given the length of all the ideas we had, one of it was really beginning with thinking about how those that were closest to him wrestled with it, and also your own moments and experiences with Moltmann. And so I wonder if you want to share a bit about what it was like as a young scholar doing the whole theological formation and your friendship with Wolff and that Pannenberg Moltmann transformation over time, because in textbooks now, if you get in most of the theology textbooks will introduce eschatological theology, and there's a weird synthesis of Moltmann and Pannenberg, and that wasn't always immediately obvious to both of them, and they dwelled on certain distinctions and such. But the like you and Wolff's relationship, played a part in learning the kind of terrain of those two figures, and so
Yeah. I love it. Instead of thinking of the way that textbooks present it, let's just think of it as these two individuals. So Tübingen and Munich are along the southern border of Germany, 2.5 hours in those days drive or train apart. And these were the two centers of gravity at the time in Protestant theology. There were others, but there was a greatness there. Moltmann lectured to doctoral students and students from around the world. Pannenberg had a lecture hall, the largest in the evangelical theology department, of 300 people, packed all the time. But you couldn't have two individuals who are more different in personality. So Pannenberg would walk up. He would get up at his wife woke him at 5. He would write the lecture from 5:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. Catch the 10:53 train from Grefelfink, come in, walk right into the lecture hall, pünktlich, right, exactly on time. Lecture. He'd have a break, lecture, and he'd walk out. And as he would say to a doctor, say the name of a doctoral student when he got to the podium. And when your name was said, you knew that you were going to walk with him for 7.5 minutes and get 3 main comments on your last draft. Moltmann loved drinking beer with his students, formed close relationships, easily moved into a mentoring role. Pannenberg's drive was to speak the power of the Christian gospel in light of the science and the philosophy, the anthropology and social sciences of our day. He did that in the most rigorous way, possibly in the entire 20th century, definitely in the second half of the 20th century. His conceptual resolutions were precise, could stand up to careful criticism. Many of the philosophy professors would come into classes or invite him in to do, German idealism. He knew as well, for example, as any philosopher at Munich, which was the world's leading area in that at that time. Moltmann brought everything together, but systematicity was just not the drive. I was working with a translator of one of his early collections of articles, and Dustin Anderson. And the translator sat down with me over coffee once and said, "It's so bloody frustrating. I'm translating along this beautiful tension between, say, a contemporary philosophical movement or an ethical problem or justice issue and the resources of Christian tradition. Tension grows and grows and grows until the penultimate page." And he said, and then this one word always comes up. Sie werden aufgehoben. So all the differences are transcended, yet preserved. 2 closing paragraphs in the article was over. So Moltmann just wanted to bring together all these tensions from a distinctively Christian perspective, still wrestling with the issues as deeply as any Christian theologian, but never moving outside of that frame. And he didn't need to resolve all the conceptual differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's most theologians have their the way their piety shapes the way they think theologically, the way the experiences that drove them, like you told Moltmann's. And if you think of Pannenberg's adolescent mystical experience related to wrestling with like Nietzsche and such, like you could see why it leads to an arch rationalist type of thinker who's going to leave no intellectual stone unturned as he goes from department to department to demonstrate the plausibility of the God revealed in Christ. And yet both of them in different ways found a kind of energy in an eschatological vision of God that's really shifting the orientation for a lot of Christian theology in the 20th century. So I wonder when you were a part of that and looking back now, how you would describe that transition in post-war theology. And that's also when you get the second quest for the historical Jesus and a return to more of the apocalyptic teachings of Jesus. They both, in many ways, are inheriting the debates that were going on between more hermeneutical types of theology and Moltmann and Karl Barth's dogmatic proposals and the question of revelation. When you think of what's shared in that historical moment, are there particular lines of questioning or insights that kind of capture the birthplace of this eschatologically oriented Christian theology?
Yeah, that's a great question. The giants of this time were Barth and Rahner. It's impossible to state the way that theology just stopped and took in its breath after Barth's great accomplishment, the Church Dogmatics, was out. And it was just clear that this was a work of such genius, it would take decades for other, especially Protestant theologians, to wrestle through. Likewise for Rahner's role. I mean, Vatican II was between roughly 1960 and 1965, was just a earth-shaking event. And coming at the same time that the student movement, which was free speech movement, which was strong in the US and also in Europe, growing Marxist movement, liberation theologians of various types. And this was the space that both Moltmann and Pannenberg were working in at that time. There was one part of Rahner that they both cited as they were working in different constructive areas. It was called Rahner's rule. And it basically said there can't be any difference between the immanent Trinity, God is in God's own eternal self, and the economic Trinity, the Trinity as revealed in the world. And that was sort of a hermeneutical principle that they used as they approached different areas of theology. So it leads to the turn to history, which both of them emphasized as a context for Trinitarian reflection. It led them to think about how history and the context of creation could be crucial for understanding God and God's eternal nature in a way that hadn't been asked in the same way, including by Barth, in my view. And it also means that in the problem of the Trinity, some ways Christianity's deepest problem, the threeness of the divine is taken for granted. But the unity of God has to be achieved. If you fail, and they both said this in lectures all the time, then you get tritheism and we fail our tradition. but you don't begin with just a mystical oneness and try to evolve some persons out of that. How could the threeness be brought together? And that's what led eschatology to become the central focus for both of them. We'll go back and find out how eschatology was tied into their personal narratives later. But as a theological problem, a conundrum, it was eschatology. So where does that take you, Tripp?
Well, so my relationship with theologians that I return to tends to be I have like ongoing summaries of how they shaped me and the ideas that they put forth, and I try to describe them in their own language. Where when I read my notes to myself about them, it triggers me to go back and pick up books and go quotes, which I've spent the last week doing. And I've updated my outline of the big theses of Moltmann's, the way the future for him functions as a new paradigm of transcendence theologically, where you see that Trinitarian dynamic, you see the inclusion of history. So I thought I'd try them out on you, so we can get live grading and assessment. Which it's been a while since you got to give me, but
you never took my grade seriously anyway, Tripp.
Well, look, they're invitations to new opportunities, just like the divine.
It's the lure of the future, Tripp. It's the lure of the future.
But yeah. So I thought I'd say them because in here as we go through them, like what it provokes in you, and then we'll flip corners and the way his engagement with the cross in particular and such opened up spaces. But as someone that found him the same time he's discovering process thought and asking questions, where you end up wanting to hang out with Philip Clayton because you're like, well, who brings together this eschatological shape of stuff and and thinking about that connects to the process tradition, which is another way, right? Like where transcendence gets inverted from something other than temporality, but transcendence happens in the flux and flow of time. And so for Moltmann, time emerges out of God's future, not just out of the past into the present. And if that's the case, then the experience of possibility or future is a gift of grace. And that insight means that both Jürgen Moltmann lets God's self-revelation in the kingdom bringer, Jesus, thematize theology in a distinctly Christian way, that as someone who, is wrestling with Moltmann, Pannenberg, and Cobb at the same time, that's remained a challenge, which, as Phil told me on a consistent basis, and a number of others on my dissertation committee, my Christocentric Baptist piety creeps out, and I problematize my process commitments on a regular basis. And going back through this, I think that's one of the reasons why. But the other side of God's self-revelation being something that happens in history with a historical trajectory is that then the ground of the act of theology in and of itself happens in the present. And the theologian in the present is the one who is trying to speak from the greatest suffering and the deepest joys, and that's the very place God is found. And so when I think about the way the future functions within his thought, it means that the revelation of God in history puts the incarnation at the center. That the incarnation is an event of God becoming human, which means the ministry of compassion and justice, the death of Jesus on the cross, the resurrection from the dead, all mutually interpret each other and collectively give the content to the one he called Abba and the movement of the Spirit. That economic Trinity is understood from the testimony about the person Jesus and his encounter with God and what God was up to in his proclamation and such. And that makes this a place where, I mean, even when you and I got to talk to Moltmann together the first time at the Emergent Village Theological Conversation, I mean, this is where he was pressing me on trying to pick sides, between my love of process and his own work. Because for him, temporality of God's transcendence is how we understand God's immanence, that they're tangled in this deep way. And so God isn't ultimately atemporal, but is temporal because of God's futurity, something that you only get the right to speak of out of the event of Christ, which is something for those of us that tend to put it in a larger metaphysical system, he finds a bit wary and told me, I tried that and I didn't get there. So God's transcendence is the horizon of the future that always confronts the presence. So like the human Jesus, we live every day in the horizon of the future. And this includes an openness of the future before an eschatological confidence, making every event of the present an event in the presence of God's coming. And that for him is the way this eschatological eruption in the imminent plane brings forth a kind of openness that those open relational theologians are loving and advocating for. I'm like, yeah, that's what's in the Bible. Congratulations, this is great. And he goes, yeah, but that gift of possibility, the grace of God moment to moment, is the potential horizon of the world's future in God. And so you both are getting the grace of a new moment, but that grace is sourced from the God who walks ahead, coming to us. And that he says that's how Jesus understood his own tradition as a human, and how the church came to understand the event of the resurrection of the dead, the first fruits in the resurrection of Jesus.
That is fascinating. Let me just do some ad lib responses and see where they take you. So the primacy of the future flows easily off the tongue, those 4 words, but it's hard as heck to understand what that really means. So for example, it means that time issues from the future. I mean, this is not Whitehead. It's sort of Whitehead stood on his head or something. Mm-hmm. Whitehead would be Blackhead. That's where the place of unity is. It means that all the openness, the contingency of our lives come from the fact that the primal causality is a lure toward a future state and not a series of causal necessities from an initial creation. Mm-hmm. Some people would see Calvin more in that. So the primacy of a fixity of a past setting in motion a process that God will guide, but causality will lead to that final outcome. For you to say that God is temporal only because of this future source, I mean, that's super hard to think. I can't think of any scientific metaphor for that. Pannenberg gets to that insight in the 1970s at the same time, using a lot of the same words. Again, Rahner plays a role here. Mm-hmm. And then takes his massive brain and his verbatim knowledge of most philosophers and theologians, literally, and begins to try to work that out systematically. Sometime we could do a show where we could talk about what the most sophisticated philosophy and theology of the future that we've had, at least in the last 100 years, looks
what
like.
If we got the guy that translated Metaphysics and the Idea of God by Pannenberg, where he lays out the ontological priority of the future?
That would be it. That would be it. That was the hardest book I ever translated. It was insane. It took 3 English sentences for every German sentence. I could give examples. But Moltmann goes in a different direction. And at the same time he's getting this insight, he's reading Ernst Bloch, who, by the way, is Jewish, Marxist, radical, on writing Das Prinzip Hoffnung, the principle of hope. And Moltmann sits with that for years. It's just clearly coming together with his personal experience, his sense of a prophetic mission of the theologian, and making hope central to theology. A theology of hope is this. It's brilliant. It's inspired by Bloch. It's inspired by the experience of the Holocaust, which the Germans caused. He lived with that as a deep, deep source of his theology, and leads to a rich rethinking of Christian resources for this confusing, amazing period at the end of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Hope is central. It also leads for Moltmann to a theology that's always on the move, a theology that's on the ground, like the liberation theology. And I want to make sure that when we're talking about stories of Moltmann, people realize how deeply devoted he was, dedicated he was to supporting the Latin American liberation theologians. Mm-hmm. He was friends with virtually all of them. He was often in Latin America, but in a consultative status. I want to be careful here, but I contrast this with the German Catholic theologian, also in Tübingen, whose lectures I heard in the same years, who became the head of the Glaubensgemeinde, the congregation of faith in Rome, which is the one that enforces Catholic orthodoxy across the church.
Mm-hmm.
So as Moltmann was meeting these individuals as men and women and helping to strengthen them as they thought and as they lived this out, Ratzinger was flying across to give judgments of the Vatican and statements of judgment.
Yeah, the future Pope.
Yeah, I know, Benedict XVI. So it's that story about Moltmann, his ability as a doctoral advisor. Many people. There were 400 dissertations written on him. Miroslav Volf said yesterday. And contrast that with the need to have an orthodoxy. Actually, Tripp, that's an interesting trinity of theologians, isn't it? The orthodoxy of the eternal teachings of the church, the philosopher theologian trying to reconcile the best of contemporary philosophy and science with the core of systematic theological principles, and this theologian of improvisation,
mm-hmm.
who has absolutely clear Christian themes, but is nuancing them for the persons and the moments and the stimuli for theological reflection.
Yeah, that actually makes me think that for Moltmann, the temporality of God is also the materiality of God. That his lens for getting there is so much something you only get to speak of out of the triune experience of Golgotha. That the temporality of God also means that the revelation of who God is for us, revealed in the Trinity, is a revelation of God for us, and that's our key for understanding how we interpret, take sides in the material order. Which is why Ernst Bloch would make so much sense to him, right?
Yeah.
He in his experiences of God book, where he tells the story about talking to Ernst Bloch, and who was really appreciative of him, reading him so closely and stuff, and they were talking, and Ernst Bloch uses the word God, and Moltmann goes, "Well, surely you don't mean the word God," and Bloch responds to him and goes, "Well, I'm an atheist on behalf of God." Because there's the principle of hope for a material reorientation of reality. That's what's harbored in the word God, and why he appreciated Moltmann's use of him so much and found him fascinating. And Moltmann, in a sense, is like, your atheism is the preconditions for my theism, and vice versa.
That is fantastic quote. That's fantastic. I think we should get nerdy, because I wanted to make you pay on a pledge you just made out loud. The place that this gets reconciled, you said, just sort of in a passing clause, is in the doctrine of the Trinity. And one might say, who's a smart person listening to this conversation, is, you guys, this isn't going to work. If you really give temporality and history the kind of openness and depth and methodological primacy, how are you going to do a unified Trinity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are kind of two ideas for me around his Trinity that every time I read them, then go chase down the quotes, I have to spend at least a week being more Trinitarian than I imagined. It's kind of like when you read David Ray Griffin explaining Whitehead. It all makes so perfect sense. Like there are certain theologians that the energy of them, when you read them, and you know who they are, what's driving them, and the way they hold their ideas and the way they lay them out, they become compelling in ways that you have a hangover from just how compelling it is. And there's no more Trinitarian moment in every year than the time I revisit Moltmann. And there he says that the revelation of the Trinity occurs in the economy of salvation. And unlike someone like Karl Barth, where the whole Trinitarian economic move is a move from eternity, the God who loves in freedom elects the Son from eternity. So the whole movement of the saga of God's history is a single action, right? In the Reformed tradition, which he makes he helps it out, right? He gets rid of double predestination, and which is great. But what Moltmann emphasizes is that the history of the Creator's self-revelation isn't a doctrine in the vacuum. It's actually God's ongoing relationship in history with the people of Israel, the person of Jesus. That's how you get to the idea of a God being for us. That's how it's demonstrated, because it's God's own activity that proves it. a God who is known through divine presence, solidarity, liberation, and freedom. That is the economy of salvation. So for Moltmann, the social doctrine of the Trinity enables a number of post-Barthian maneuvers, like the inclusion of temporality in the life of God, the political and ecclesiological reflections he gets. He ends up having a greater openness to religious pluralism and than the others. Celebration of feminist and liberation theologians' critiques and rejoinders, and ultimately, he's one of these like theological giants who was inspired by the emergence of Pentecostalism. And so that revelation of the Trinity like opens these things up. And what's fascinating to me is the way the immanent Trinity is the assertion that it couldn't all be collapsed the other way is because that's who God is. And so for Moltmann, the Trinity is necessary, and it's because it's grounded in the actual story of Jesus, the sociality of Jesus. He spends time talking about like the baptism and looking at the prayers of Jesus. So if what Jesus said, did, and endured is the life of God and not one among other transitory disclosures, then God within God's self is the unity of divine sociality, Father, Son, Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. And even more emphatically for Moltmann, and this is one of those places that I love the way he does it versus what Pannenberg ends up doing in volume 3 of his Systematic. Moltmann insists that it's because of this that we can know the genuine character of God and banish Luther's shadow side of God that echoes through the Christian tradition. This observation he shares with Eberhard Jungel, another German legend of that time. A shadow in the divine life, he argues, is no longer possible after the resurrection of the cross-dead Jesus. If the very heart of God is revealed on the cross, then God knows that event internally. It reveals how a God of love weaves the crosses of history in the divine life. And for those baptized into Christ's body, it gives us an orientation towards materiality, one where we become participants, invited, right, moment to moment, as the future of God meets us, to give reality, give materiality to what's happened in Christ, the divine presence, solidarity, liberation, freedom, even play, right? Like that's one of these things that of the Trinitarian theologians. Here's a whole book on play, because there's a genuine joy that the potentials of human life in our relationships with our neighbor, enemy, and non-human neighbors is actual participating in the divine life. And it's something you can't shirk off and make a secondary doctrine, because God has shown us who God is in the materiality of the person Jesus. And when that reveals not just an idea about God, but the very heart of God eternal, the immanent Trinity, then this isn't a doctrine you exercise, then put in some doxology. It's actually the invitation to what life of faith looks like. And so why else would you not take so seriously the questions your students have and go drink with them till late in the night and talk about it? Why would you not fly over to Latin America and help start new theological schools with liberation theologians? Why would you not insist that you're only not going to contribute to volumes unless your wife, who inspired him, is a famous feminist theologian in her own right, and the liberation theologians who read you are going to be in it, right? There's this sense that to do Christian theology is to hear the voices of those who die cross-dead in the present. And it's not a secondary thing, an ethical thing. It is giving speech to the materiality of the divine. And that for me makes like why his Trinitarian theology is so compelling, because it's not a metaphysical principle. We can describe it metaphysically if we want to or need to. And that's a challenge, and we can work on it. And he can look at us and go, y'all are a bit too concerned about these other things. Because the Trinity, that dynamic between the immanent and economic Trinity, is the very place for Christian existence. And the reason we can trust it, the reason why the God is love with no remainder, that the mystery of God doesn't have a shadow side of judgment and wrath, but it's the mystery of unlimited love yet to be discovered, is because the economic Trinity of God revealed on the cross is who God is in God's self. That's who is for us. And if that God is for us, how could you be against your neighbor or your enemy or a creation that can't find its breath because of our action? Or why would you take seriously historic divides in the life of the church and demonization towards your non-Christian neighbor? Those are all places where the cross has not come to interpret your relations to the world. You're not being a good Trinitarian. So to me, it's so compelling. You can see why it inspires a host of theologians coming after him to weave deep theological reflection with the prophetic critique, because the prophetic critique is how you actually participate in the divine life. It's not a doctrine that happens after we get done with the creed. I mean, even in like his Christology, he's like, why we should probably update the creed because it skips from a conception to a cross, and neither one of them makes sense unless you know who God is telling us God is. And that's and he inserts, right, the preaching of the kingdom of God and the exorcism of those possessed and solidarity with the excluded and proclaiming the year of Jubilee. And anyway, sorry, Phil.
No, that's good. Let's step back and just make sure that the big lines of what you just said are accurate. There's some areas there that don't follow quite so easily, but let's get the big picture and make sure that everyone's on the same page with that one. So, I mean, you really started with, you had two main points. Let's start with the revelation of the divine, of the Trinity in the world, in the change, the flow, what theologians call the economy of salvation. And let's look at it in all the forms, Father, Son, and Spirit, as we see them revealed in history. And then let's recognize that they cannot exist just in that separate manifestation. The whole thing is revealing one immanent, so in itself, three-personed divine. Okay, now when you put those together, what happens? You start in Christian theology with the revelation of God in history. We're looking to the flow of time. We're looking to events that occur on the dusty roads of Palestine, right? And we're looking for an economy of salvation. That means we're looking for the actions of God reaching out to reconcile the world to God's self. What happens, though, is we see the actions of the three persons as different. Okay, so it looks like there's three characters in this story. There's a creator God, there are prophets, which are looking forward, and then there's this manifestation, incarnation of God on earth. That's something separate. This is Jesus Christ. And then there's a spirit that is a part of creation. It's Ruach to the Israelites. It's the spirit of Christ in John 14, right? And then it's the spirit that makes Christ present afterwards. So we're left with this puzzle, right? And then following Moltmann, you say, all right, so what we have to imagine is that before, during, and after, these are manifestations of a single being in itself with these three persons living in it. So the so-called social trinity, living in an interactive way. And Moltmann and Pannenberg and many other theologians were trying to formulate exactly how that social trinity would work. What happens then is we go from the variegated history of the divine self-revelation in history, but through a postulate of faith to their unity as the one Trinitarian God. It's really interesting that Moltmann never gave up, and you're right to stress it in your second point, that target. But it always remained a postulate in everything he did. As you said, traveling to the liberation theologians. He was active in the International Charismatic Movement. He would go and consult in Southeast Asia with some of the leaders of that movement. He spoke with the theologians, the Pentecostal theologians. Amazing for a German theologian. And with liberation questions and with social justice questions. Always from this postulate that the whole thing would come together as it, in fact, it has always been one. At the end of history. And it was so interesting to be a few miles to the east and watch the very different way that Pannenberg took essentially the same position, but worked out a different dimension of it. That is, we need to be able to show how it makes sense for us to make both claims at the same time. So Moltmann is setting his sail to the winds of the Spirit and being guided by that, with always the postulation that there's a destination for the boat or a celestial city for Christian in Pilgrim's Progress. And Pannenberg is saying, I can show this in social science. I can show this in philosophy. I can show this in comparative religious studies. I can show it in the history of systematic theology. I mean, what an interesting complementarity between the two.
Mm-hmm. Do you think part of like if you ask Moltmann where to show it, he would show it in the like the ecumenical movement of the church, and the church being refashioned in the West by its failures that he was very much a part of, and being being transformed by the underside of the church that's been muted for so long, getting to give testimony to their own experiences of God.
We're getting close to a really major point, which I hope we can get to. But let's just look at the different way that Moltmann and Pannenberg did the ecumenical movement. So Moltmann was there with every branch of the church, connecting, being warm and drinking German beer. Like that's how ecumenic work works, and creating the relationships. And then he was an essayist, so he would write many books with collections of his talks, his individual talks as a road toward ecumenical unity. They played a huge role, talk by talk, and each one was very much to in German, Sitz im Leben, to a particular situation that he was pointing to. Pannenberg convened an ecumenical group and made a commitment that every semester he would teach an overload, together with sometimes usually a Catholic and an Orthodox theologian, and a group of students who would join all the time. Some of his major doctoral students were formed. Friedrich Nusse, who has a chair in University at Heidelberg now, was a major part of those, and then wrote a dissertation on it and became a leading voice on it, for example. Working toward agreements, working in the international ecumenical movement, theological agreements. Pannenberg was formulating the conceptual ways that we could bridge between the two. Moltmann was out in the beer fest. He was out doing the evangelism on the ground, as it were. Isn't that an interesting complementarity between their two approaches?
Yeah. Yeah, and it kind of makes sense of how the two get to very different responses once the questions of sexuality get raised, because Pannenberg's conversation partners are like conservative German Catholics and the Orthodox tradition, and he's trying to bridge that conversation. And Pannenberg is in that kind of context, moves him to more conservative type of responses than Moltmann, who is engaging conversations with liberation theologians and feminist theologians.
Yeah, that was fascinating. That was the point where their relationship finally ruptured. I think it was over the political differences, which became clearer by the early 1980s. And they sort of began going their separate ways. It was a famous, actually the separation started earlier. It was a famous conflict. But they didn't publicly berate each other, but one could sense in their comments about the other a kind of German coldness. Only the German language can communicate coldness like English can never do. That careful use of the Z, that long pause before you give the four verbs at the end of the sentence. You really know that the guy's in trouble. And it was clear to those of us who are close to both of them that this was both very serious and deep, and also personally tragic to them, that they would be these two voices for Christian unity who are so deeply divided. I know the full inside story, but I'll just say that Moltmann, there were some conversations, there was an ongoing exchange of letters, which I hope will be published someday, and I know they exist. And then there was a movement, and Herr Wenz, by the way, Pannenberg's most visible German doctoral student who had a position in South Germany by that time, Augsburg, I think. I think he played a role. So at some point, Moltmann invited Pannenberg to do a public presentation in Tübingen. Pannenberg accepted, went, did the public presentation with Moltmann in the audience, and then they went out for just the two of them for dinner. And it was about, my guess is 5 months later, Pannenberg invited Moltmann to Reformationstag, so the day of Reformation, great for a Reformation theologian, and they went out together. And Pannenberg told me on a walk soon after that they'd been reconciled. No public anathemas against each other, a very quiet, gentle reconciliation, which many German theologians at the time were involved in. And I know Miroslav and I were both supporting that. And then, despite strong political disagreements, the movement to move forward. I think it's important for people to remember that ecumenicism is about overcoming personal walls between others. It's not just theory. And that's a great example.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk any more about this, the general theological themes. I want to try to think about Moltmann among the great theologians of the last 100 years and see if you and I can find a way to place him somehow. But there may be something else you want to cover first.
Wait, well, I want to say one more thing, but when you said that, it actually made me think of a moment when we were together with him at the Emergent Village Theological Conversation. So this is a time where more of the mainline Protestant denominations in America were, open and affirming and all that kind of stuff. And evangelicals are distancing themselves from the emerging church movement over LGBTQ issues. And someone asked him about it, and he goes, Americans love talking about sex. I have one rule for this. If a theologian talks about sex more than he talks about economics, he is very, very idolatrous.
I forgot that covered.
And he's just, because underneath it, you could just imagine him going like, well, there's a correct, like, I can tell you what I'm thinking about this, but Americans, your bigger problem is y'all have an argue about this and not question your role in the global economic system that's oppressing so many. I was just like, oh, that's his other big response. And was when they asked him if he was a universalist, he goes, I am not. There are people I never want to see again. But I'm worried that God is, and it's he was a master of one-liners.
It absolutely. It shows two things about Moltmann. The one is that the deepest justice issues were his compass, and so if people are involved in some trivial debate, he had a way of just getting back to naming the deeper justice issue, usually the one that the injustice that the people in the room were involved in and not aware of, and that was his genius. And the second one is his sense of humor. You organized an event at American Academy of Religion once. I forget which year it was. Moltmann was there. A lot of homebrewed beer was being served. It was a large audience in an auditorium not far from the big venue, with lots of German-induced beer-induced energy. And I was supposed to introduce Moltmann to the audience. So I came up and I said, Moltmann's English is not very good, so I'll need to be translating all these comments into German just so he can follow. And I looked at him and his eyebrows sort of raised, but you could tell that there was a joke coming. And so I'd give some standard sentence for Americans about the significance of his work. And then I'd turn to Moltmann and say in German something that utterly contradicted what I had just said to the American audience, and sort of played on the differences between the German and American cultures. And he was just obviously enjoying it. And there were maybe 3 people in the audience who were laughing out loud, and I was going, oh, that's a good translation, I'm sure. So he had that constant sparkle in his eye. And I think he was disarming in theological discussions because he knew how to turn to that light note of humor or the one-liner to get a point across that no amount of argumentation would have done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the one other idea about his eschatological framing on the cross that I find it hard to give an account that its aesthetical beauty is more compelling than his. And when he talks about the cross and resurrection, except for that one sentence in his second Christology, which I'm sure we'll get there, but the turn the back line. But he takes God's death. He talks about God taking death into God's own life. That the Son of the Father dies on the cross as a rebel revolutionary, a blasphemer, God-forsaken, alone without God. And the Father experiences grieving of the death of the Son. And so on the cross, we see that God, the God who is love, is the Father who bore the death of the Son through his grieving, the Son who knows death and abandonment, the Spirit whose binding love conquers death. And for Moltmann, this means that all who die cross dead in history, and in the text he references, Hegel's The Bloody Bench of Human History, a diatribe, and how that waves in the life of the Spirit. And he's like, Hegel, you can't even get to the depths of this. That all those who die cross dead in history do so with the triune love of a grieving parent, a sibling who stands in solidarity, and a faithful and binding spirit of love that knows cross, sin, law, death can break. And for me, the ugliest parts of the Christian tradition fail to give an account that beautiful. those of us that struggle around the category of self-revelation and collapsing all doctrine into eschatology and Christology and can't figure out how to get there, it's hard for us to say a triune statement about that experience with that kind of power. And so for Moltmann, the future of the coming kingdom is grace and possibilities in each moment. So that there's like that's happening right there in the moment, and grace and possibility is the horizon of history. This opens up for him that participatory vision of God in the world, in which all creation always already participates, and one in which the church grounds its hope, sustains its faith, inspires its action, enlivens its friendship. A theme in his ecclesiology that's like my favorite section of any book, and the one I have basically completely underlined. And it provokes solidarity and ensures justice worthy of a God who is love. So for me, that the connection between the Trinity and the cross and his eschatology is him looking at history and refusing to let go. Right? It's like he's seizing the ugliness of history and going, I'm holding it here on behalf of the potential beauty and life and joy that's there. And then he seizes the cross of Christ, and that's the place you encounter the horizon of hope. And he's sitting there with these, and they're like charging through him, and that's where the eschatological thinking comes up. But he thinks that if you let go of like an honest facing of reality, then you let go of the task of Christian theology. And start to deny the crosses that are strewn in history. But if you also let go that our ability to speak hope is a hope that's only made possible by a God who's revealed the world's future in the resurrection of the cross-dead Christ, then the hope you're managing and the justice you might be seeking will never be one in history that justifies saying God is love or that God is indeed Abba. And this is one of those places where it's like he gives an expression, like Pannenberg says, well, there's a true but limited sense that God doesn't yet exist. And Moltmann wants to go, yes. But what does that yes mean for him? You get that contrast of temporality in God means materiality. It means seizing the full ugliness and horror of history, and then seizing it in a hopeful, risking kind of confidence that faith gives, because there's this triune encounter with the cross, the grieving Father, the solidarity of our brother in Christ, and a Spirit who holds us beyond sin, law, and death. And that, man, that like just gets me pumped every time I read it, and I just go, when you hear that, I'm like, man, I should just be a real good Orthodox Christian. Look, I can't think of something more beautiful than that. It turns you to your neighbor and the other. It tells you that all the things you carry and can't speak, you have a solidarity with someone in Christ. It tells you when you can't find words to put to the pain and grief that you're going through or those you stand beside, that God is grieving and weeping with you. And it says that when you hear the story of Jesus, when you tell that, you're telling what the bonding bind of the Spirit of love looks like. That it has a future that death cannot conquer. And that love, that's the love that's bound in the Spirit, is the one that's bound in you. It's the one you were baptized into before you could talk. It's the one you meet and are nourished by at the table. And it's the one you get to embody in the world, because that future that it promises meets you moment to moment, and you get to say yes to the invitation of the divine. And I'm like, oh, hell yeah. Come on, Multi, give it to me. Anyway.
Tripp, I have never heard you that eloquent except late in a boot camp evening. So for this to happen early in the day, this really must be a theological.
I'm just drunk on the Spirit, Phil. I was going over all this the last 3 hours,
Exactly. So. I've got an Acts 2 moment going on. And in fact, a lot of what you just said sounded like tongues to me. What is really interesting, I've never thought this before, it may be true, let's figure it out, is that Moltmann comes across as much more deeply in the spirit of the Lutheran tradition, and Pannenberg comes across much more like the careful reasoning Calvin, motivated by a deep faith in the institutes, but insisting that it's got to be systematic, and whatever those implications are, I'm going to hold to them, even if it's double predestination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ordained before the foundations of the earth that some should be born to eternal salvation and others to eternal damnation. And this is not through any choice that they made prior. It was the divine choice in the beginning. Your Moltmann, and I think it rings true, has this insistence on the maximizing the presence of the threefold God in history, recoiling from the horrors of history, being constantly involved, sometimes as a still small voice and sometimes in powerful prophetic action, to speak and work for justice, to bring about justice, with the final goal of which turns out to be the original, of the unity of these three divine persons. Without losing faith in the long-term narrative, we immerse ourselves in the evil and horror of the realities of history. Pannenberg, taking each of those moments, and I've heard it and read it and debated with him, and saying, how can we do this? How is this possible? How can we think this? Wie soll das gedacht werden? How can we think our way through this? Amazing, amazing contrast. All right, I'd like to do something really challenging, because I think the conversation at this point has been clear. I think it's been accurate to Moltmann and Pannenberg, but I think that we owe it to ourselves and to others to try to place Moltmann, to understand what that core approach is, in contrast to others who are important to many of your listeners and to us as well. And so that's what I'd like to see if I can raise a question with you and see where it takes us. So I'll just say it really, really clearly and briefly, and then let's see where we go. Moltmann introduces the radical ideas of a theologian on the ground, of a theology, I'm going to say, in process. He never failed to connect with the person he was with in the room, no matter where he or she stood along a theological spectrum. There's an interpersonal connection. Out of that connection, thought occurred. Moltmann over and over again introduced radical ideas. He was perceptive to the most interesting, provocative ideas on the horizon for decades and decades, into his 90s, to be honest. He brought freshness to these theological debates. And yet he always embraced these ideas within or under the context of a Christian theology. He never, in his writings and in any conversation I ever had with him, never allowed the radical ideas to undercut core Christian premises. And that's why I kind of like the Luther example. His work was always fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding. I never saw him say, I just finished a book and I don't know where the hell this is going to go. I think my Christian faith is really in trouble here, right? He didn't have the dark night of the soul. At least we weren't aware of it, maybe after too much beer. In contrast with that, think of a lot of people in the process philosophy movement who work to bring that together with Christian theology. I mean, let's take Joe Bracken, who also passed recently. Just one example, a book called The World in the Trinity. He uses this process framework, but also open-ended systems work as a way to understand the Trinity, but begins with the provocative title and runs it all the way through the book. The world is fully in the Trinity. That's not Rahner's rule. You can't do that with Rahner's rule. And contrast that with, say, God in creation, Moltmann's doctrine of creation. I remember being at the West Coast Theological Society and in a debate, and somebody's reading a paper on that book. And I said, these are principles of panentheism. And this brilliant theologian said, no, Moltmann pulls back from full panentheism. Look at the following ways where he protects himself against, we say panentheism is the double in. So God in creation and creation in God. Moltmann's title is God in creation. Joe Bracken's title is the world within the Trinity, within God. So Moltmann pulls back. He's not quite so clear about the double in, the creation in God. So let me find out if that basic idea makes sense, and I'd love to then go over some of the crucial areas of his thought and his action, and to see whether this framework fits or doesn't. Who's to the left of him and who's to the right of him, Tripp? I mean, maybe that's in one sense the question I'm asking.
Okay, so just on like that contrast with Joe and Moltmann that might get be helpful. In some sense, Moltmann would say he will be a panentheist at the eschaton, right? That's the like he'll get the double N at the eschaton, the world in God and God in the world. But it's the historical reality on the ground, the gap between the nature and character of the God who is love and the world so he has a kind of eschatological panentheism. Because like when you read the eschatological sections in God and creation, that's where he sounds like both ends are there. But that's at a point where sin, law, and death have become subject to the Father, and God is all in all. And so there's a kind of dynamism that the temporality of God includes a changing kind. One of the ends is fluctuating, and the other one's a given.
Okay, but let's think about why many people are drawn to process theology. We're drawn because it's not enough to say someday it's all going to be reconciled. I have to say right now, in a world filled with evil, how can I understand how the creator God would be so passive? Why would God stand aside and let this suffering happen? I mean, I'm back to the brothers Karamazov debate. You know, this if the whole foundation of the earth, of God's cosmic plan, is based on the suffering of this little girl locked in the outdoor privy overnight, praying to dear kind God, says Ivan, if that's the ticket to admission to the kingdom, I'd turn the ticket back in. And process theology says, let's wrestle with this now. Is the reconciliation trip only going to be at that final end when we can see that God becomes all in all? Or don't we have to find a way to think how God is all in all now?
Yeah. Yeah. And now I know that different process theologians do this a bit differently, but Marjorie Suhaki's engagement with Moltmann wants to take something like Moltmann's the whole flow of history and make the eschatological is what happens in each moment of becoming. So there is both the inversion of the mental and physical poles between God and the world, and so like in a moment, God receives the world fully, judges it, redeems it into the life of God, and then the world in the next moment meets the grace, possibilities, call, lure that you hear is similar to Moltmann's. And so there's a kind of micro eschatologies that take place in a process thought moment to moment that could enable a different kind of the double N rather than an eschatological double N.
I think some of us should be dissatisfied with that answer, though I like Margie's eschatology very much, but some of us should be dissatisfied with that because we think about structural evil.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's a reconciliation in a moment of this string of moments, which is the individual, the society of occasions, does not take away systematic racism for a person with a black skin, or does not take away sexism, or does not take away the forms of violence that are touching people around. And the process theology has been able to give a vibrant theory of justice because of the limited power of God. So I believe the theodicy question is solved, and the directionality of what God's luring toward, maximizing the freedom of the individual. It's a problem that doesn't leave us wondering whether this God is just. Faith can say at the end of the process, Christian comes home, all is reconciled, and there shall be no more tears, Revelation 20. But in between, on these misty flats, what else is required? So I really want to draw a contrast between the fideism, I'm going to be harsh here, of a Lutheran. No one's ever said this about Moltmann before, but that long-term faith, as in the moment we're not sure how it reconciles, and the clarity of a process theological position.
Yeah. So that tension was really the birthplace of divine self-investment, because
Absolutely.
Moltmann's is notorious for self-limitation, right? So once you have a God, as God is in God's self, and then he uses the Zinzum kind of thing, the making the divine withdrawal to make space for creation.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, the integrity of creation, God limits God's self and ties a metaphorical divine hand behind God's back, and relates to creation. But like the confidence of a creation that only comes into being because God limited God's self and gave it autonomy, then there's a kind of eschatological confidence that the hand can come out from behind the back if needed. I don't know if I remember the story correctly, but when Moltmann came on Cobb's invitation to Claremont in the 60s or 70s or so, like Catherine and Bruce Epperly and Bernard Loomer were there. This is that time period.
A little bit later, 70s.
Okay,
Later
so
70s.
when he comes there, and John asks him, well, what happens if we just set off a nuclear holocaust? And, Moltmann's answer is, well, that's why there's a second hand behind the back, more or less, that a process person, both rejecting creation out of nothing as normally described and such resists. And that moment inspired Catherine's kind of criticism of Moltmann's eschatology, even though she wants to celebrate all the participatory, liberatory,
and she leaves
things.
Apocalyptic thinking for decades and only comes back to it in these recent 2 books. It also reminds me of a recent book by Keith Ward, where he has the same thing. On our planet, one of many planets where there could have been Christs, if something had gone wrong so that Jesus wasn't going to make it to the cross and the redemption take place, God would have intervened. And I said with another critic, so Keith, you mean, what if it took like hundreds or thousands or millions of micro interventions to get Jesus to the cross so the work could happen because he was the chosen one? Keith said, yeah, then it would have happened. Okay, this is time. Wait. No. This is time for me to channel my inner Tom Ord. I can feel it coming after 25 years of fighting with Tom about this. Because Tom would say, no hands tied behind the back. That's not theology. Whitehead allows us to come into the discussion with all our cards on the table and to give an adequate resolution. All you have to do is give up voluntary self-limitation by God. Essential kenosis. So where to go with that, Tripp?
Yeah, I mean,
where's your inner Tom Ord when we need him?
Well, I think that's why he grounds God's relationship eternity in eternal kenosis. And you see that's an interesting move, right? So instead of the history of the triune God on the cross, it's the energy of the incarnation all the way to the cross that makes normative for divine activity. A very similar investment in materiality, possibility, justice, but it answers a question theologically that a metaphysical question that Moltmann, in the way he's receiving the tradition, doesn't put on the table. Yeah. And I think that for me, one of the reasons of like using self-limitation and contrasting it with self-investment is that if we take seriously even Moltmann's Trinitarian thinking, if you take his Christology first, that we get to talk about God because God showed us who God is in Christ, then Jesus does not keep a hand behind his back. He's fully invested. There's all hands in, and here's what the economy of the Trinity looks like. It looks like kenosis. It goes all the way to the cross. It gives invitations and possibilities to sinners, tax collectors, and the rulers alike. Right. So there's this the self-investment versus self-limitation. I think can be well, at least is what I told everyone. I thought was a bringing together of a Christologically tinged process tradition and the recognition of God's own. See, the consequent nature gets something to say about who God is and God's self, and thematizing your metaphysical picture in the history of Jesus. And so one of the resistance moments of resistance that became overly clear to me in Europe, where they don't hang out with process theologians as often when they talk about it, is they generally like certain parts of process thought, but then they raise the self-revelation question. And sometimes I think they're right in the sense that the picture of God does not change because of God and God's relationship to the world. God's modality that shows up, the way God invests in a moment, doesn't ultimately change through the movement of the cosmic epoch. What God can do and how God relates and the complexities that are being inherited and all that are there. But but do we come to know more of who God is because in the history of Israel or the person of Jesus, or insert other religious traditions, you actually have an ongoing dynamism between God and a particular people and context. And that's something that, I mean, even in predicament of belief, and the way you've are inheriting, out of Pannenberg and this kind of tradition, and then thinking about God's like how the reality of God gains traction metaphysically with the language and experience encounter with God in history and traditions. I mean, I think that is a place that the process tradition has a hard time exploring. And so I think both pushbacks are true. Like, how does God self-thematize God's self, and that take account of things? And do you really need to create a priori commitments of self-limitation from the beginning?
Yeah. Good. I want to slow way down here and take a deep breath, because we're at one of the key questions that Moltmann and Pannenberg raised, and we still struggle with in our decade. And I'd like to make it really, really clear so that each person can locate where they stand along this continuum, as it were. You know that I don't side with Tom Ward on essential kenosis. You know that I do take a position like Moltmann on this one. You probably also know that my first published article in the Journal of Religion, before I turned in my dissertation on Pannenberg, already was pushing back against his understanding of the final consummation of the future, proleptically present in Christ, even though I use the word proleptic in my marriage vows. So, this was a pretty deep concept, but there's also something problematic with it. So let me just take 3 parts of Moltmann's work and try to identify how he takes a very specific position with a sort of more evangelical theology on his right, with more, say, fully processed theology on his left, because I think we really need to understand how he represents a specific option that will be attractive to some and not. And then I'd love to hear you talk about pros and cons, where that'll take you. So just 3 examples. I can think of 7, but take the Theology of Hope. So he's reading this radical Jewish Marxist, Ernst Bloch. It's this in the end, it was 3-volume Das Prinzip Hoffnung, the Principle of Hope. And he pulls back from this genuine openness and uncertainty. So, for example, the second volume is called Construction. He won't be a constructivist about the future, right? He has the firm hope in the imminent Trinity, right, as his location. The openness is limited by faith, right? We mentioned God in Creation book, the panentheism that's, as you correctly say, eschatological for him, not the panentheism that, say, I've worked on during my career. Here's a more personal example. So he had a debate with Miroslav in the early 1990s, Miroslav Volf, that was widely covered. Remember, Miroslav grew up in Yugoslavia, in a small, really a village. And he told me, as we were just both heading to doctoral studies, 1989, I think, he said, this war is going to happen and is going to be unbelievably bloody and horrid. And he was grieving that in advance. And sure enough, the war broke out between Serbs and Croatians. In Miroslav's own village, a number of his friends, his family members or relatives were killed by Serbs as Croatians. And Miroslav said theologically, in the years after that war, we must say that God forgives sin, but not that God forgets sin. Moltmann, and he wrote that in contrast to Moltmann's position, which is that for God to forgive is so thoroughly to forgive that the sin is forgotten. I think that's really interesting that Miroslav, coming from that personal experience, was closer to the Jews and others who say after Auschwitz, nie vergessen, never forget. And finally, really, and this, we might want to go deep in this example, is the crucified God. You read the title and you think, okay, so here we have somebody who understands death of God theology, who understands the most radical. And then as you get into it, those crucial passages late in the book, we could go through them if we want, Moltmann pulls back. So obviously it's not God who's crucified, but God suffers as a father the loss of a son. but he does not endorse the traditional view and the traditional heretical view, patripassianism, that is that the Father suffers. It's the second person of the Trinity alone who suffers. And in a kind of one step remove, the Father suffers as Father, but not. So he's pulling back from the complete inclusion of all of God in kenosis, death, and resurrection. That's so interesting. Let me just pause and see where those three examples take you.
Okay. We should spend more on the last one, but
yeah, me too. I agree. And I'm going to refill a coffee cup because this is the big moment of this conversation. You keep going.
All right. So the one of the elements of his in Theology of Hope and his conversation with Bloch and the Death of God movement and all of that, it gives him a different dimension to what's required to speak of God than, say, Pannenberg, even though because they both have these eschatological framings, they have this dual loyalty in a sense to articulating the Christian understanding of God, but also it has to be one that it will eventually be plausible in the world. But the plausibility structure for Pannenberg, right, like at the eschaton, is more of a comprehensive intellectual understanding. And I think from
unfair though to leave out the other dimensions. They need a coherent statement, but all parts of our self, soul, quest for sanctification, and so forth should be included.
But his energy is like the energy that drives it. It sends him to writing a philosophy of science for 900 pages to go through this.
277 in German. So okay. But anyway, but I'm going to put in a little protest flag, but you should keep going on your main point.
Well, the main point is that for both of them, and Moltmann, and kind of because of his conversation with a number of the Jewish atheist philosophers post World War II, is a recognition that to speak God, the word God, apart from history is idolatrous, and history cannot yet bear the word God if it means the one Jesus called Abba. And so to do theology is to risk in faith the ultimate justification at the end of history. And so to talk about the triune God, there's a fidelity to the tradition and trying to capture it. But at the heart of it is a risk that the future of the world is the one revealed in the person of Jesus. And that proleptic thing is something both Pannenberg and Moltmann share. And I think for Moltmann, especially in Theology of Hope and in Crucified God, that history can't bear the weight of the word God if it means who Jesus said God was, is something he takes utterly seriously. And goes with them, if it's less than that, then you're right. You just shouldn't use the word God. And he looks at a lot of Christian theologians to his left and go, you've already deflated the definition of God so much, it's not worthy of Abba. And then that kind of pushback from people like Bloch, Adorno, Benjamin, is really important. And the connection of that actually is why I find that conversation with Wolff so fascinating, because if you did the question of memory with the very philosophers he's footnoting, you might get to Wolff's conclusion over his. And we have a mutual friend who Jeremy Fackenthal, who spent time working on this in his dissertation. And that he uses the picture that Benjamin, the angel, and the devastation picture. I forgot what's the name of he's going to be disappointed. I forgot the name of the artist, but it's the angel of history. And a lot of times the West, in the way we tell our story, which has been just tangled up right in the story of civilization, baptized into the life of the church, it looks to the future in a kind of way you don't understand what's behind you. And what the picture for these kind of like German critical thinkers is like, no, the angel's walking backwards, right? That you looking at what's under the feet, like the promise, like to forget is to end up normalizing all sorts of things we treat as natural, civilization, our economic and political structures, and all these things that have dead bodies under the feet. And so, like, I even think Wolff's pushback is kind of an invitation for Moltmann to connect to some of the earlier intuitions in his work,
which he didn't do. And this is a moment we should think of. So, but actually, something more interesting strikes me. As I have heretically said that it's the parts of Moltmann's work are closer to the Lutheran tradition, Lutheran theological tradition of two worlds, and parts of Pannenberg's work are closer to Reform Calvin. So in some ways, you seem closer to Moltmann, and here I closer to Whitehead, which is not how we've seen it before. So Tripp Fuller, I hereby challenge you to a public debate at the next boot camp. Moltmann versus Whitehead.
Who's going to take sounds more like purgatory, Phil.
Now, with enough good beer, it's going to be fun.
Okay. Well, I might start on one position, and if depending on how many beers there are, by the end, I'll just be preaching a sermon about the triune experience of the cross.
You absolutely will. But I think this is really interesting because this conversation has brought some core decisions that people make about the primary orientation to one's entire theological work. And both of us have put decades into that work. And there are some questions that are becoming clear, or clearly formulated anyway, here that have, in our 20 years of work together, haven't surfaced so strongly.
I want to ask you a way to how you would phrase this question. And this is something that came up when we were
boot camp takedown, beer camp takedown.
When we were teaching Moltmann, and it's come up in conversation since then. And it how would you put the question, and maybe in a more fair way, of that Moltmann, Pannenberg, the eschatological theologians raise for contemporary theologians in the present when it comes to God? Because both of them resisted the kind of Kantian option of not having of limiting our conversation about God to kind of his structural framework. Both of them resisted the dogmatic harbor of Barth, even though they both deeply appreciate him.
Yes. Well said.
And I think that there have been new, like post-Kantian philosophical avenues for a lot of contemporary theologians to end up doing theology without recognizing the Christological or eschatological wager of Christian theology. And so that in different ways, the eschatological tradition, that Moltmann, Pannenberg, Jungel, in a different way, or has that the doctrine of God, if you're a Christian theologian, is so shaped by its eschatological flavor. Something Michael Velker in his tribute puts at to Moltmann Ford, that today Christian theologians either run to confessions and traditions when they want to talk about God, or their concept of God is rather deflated and may not have too much traction with the world.
Yeah.
And I wonder if thinking of at a time now where Moltmann and Pannenberg have passed, Joe Bracken has just passed, that there's a generation of theologians who asked or saw the task of Christian theology differently than those that came alive kind of post or in post-structuralism and beyond of sorts.
Yeah. That's a brilliantly clear way to formulate the question, and it really is worth some attention because there is not clarity across those writing in theology. Let's leave out for this conversation two more extreme positions: the reduction of theology to philosophy. So it just becomes an expression of philosophy. We could list a number of liberal theologians where we could say that happened. A purely dogmatic or faith-based set of propositions about God, or might even just be quoting scripture verses on this side. So those exist. They're strong forces in our time, but let's just take them off for a moment. Okay, what remain, however, closer to each other are two competing positions. In the one, a dualism remains between what we see now and what we affirm for the eschaton. There remains a difference. And let's be really honest here, since we're sort of crossing boundaries. I've said in print for several decades ago that I'm a theological dualist in that sense. There's something about that final eschaton that isn't fully manifest and can't be even fully thought in the present. So it's interesting that I find myself now leaning more toward what we might call the process philosophy side of the spectrum. I hear you leaning more toward that gap, that division, that difference between the already and the not yet. Pannenberg is clearly on the side of reconciliation. For him, the future is really present, proleptically present, not here and now. So the risen Christ became manifested, but that's the Christ of the final consummation. So in his view of time, with a strong statement of thinking what the primacy of the future means, thinking that through, we can speak of the presence. There's a unity in that thought. And he says in the Basic Questions in Theology that, it's already in the Christology, 1963. No theological statement can be made about the resurrection that goes against the historical data. We have to work within the framework of historiography, or he'd say social sciences or natural sciences or so forth. The other position, the more faith-based position, is we see diversity now. We know that the eschaton is built into the nature of the Christian proclamation, Jesus' proclamation. We have faith that at that place, all shall be one in all manner of things. So all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. But paraphrasing, the connection, the unification will occur. And I think that we really need to think sharply, more clearly about that contrast, that this conversation on Moltmann and Pannenberg has amazingly brought clarity to the question in a way that I haven't seen it for a long time.
In that contrast, right? So, like in contrast to Pannenberg, some would say it's more of like a promissory unity.
Nice. That's a good term.
And I think that I wonder if this has to do with just the way the theologian's own piety works, because I mean, I would say, like, I would lean in towards promissory unity just because the way I envision the activity or vocation of a Christian theologian is, I've always resonated with that, with the quote that I read at the beginning from Moltmann, and I'm not going to like limit the boundaries of what the theologian's talking about to have a more fideistic harbor of sorts for confessional language, but that promissory unity is also connected to how one sees one's faith in the present. And I was having a conversation with I probably won't say it, a very famous Calvinist theologian who engages in religion science stuff, and we were hanging out at after a intellectual
I won't out
gathering.
you here, Tripp.
And we were having a number of beverages and such, and the level of confidence he had in Christian theology at getting everything right. So now he saw his engagement with science and philosophy as means to show everyone that this is the correct answer. And then the Christology seemed to play such a rather minimal role in what he was thinking. And I was sitting there and thinking, I goes, this just seems weird to me. He goes, well, I mean, you've wrote books on Jesus. I mean, you like, in this kind of way. And I said, yeah, but I sit here and ask all these questions about science and religion and pluralism and evil and things. And that's because my own form of life is so shaped by the person of Jesus. It's inspiring and things, but it deserves nothing less than me being skeptical and critical and faithful and trying to engage these things. And I can imagine coming to conclusions where I would still be a philosopher of religion and not a Christian. And I could end up being wrong, and at the eschaton find out, that you should have wagered it this way, and so that promissory unity for the theologian who takes that seriously means there's a kind of wager in your constructive work. There's a wager in the way you live it out and engage in the world. And then like your confidence meter changes when it goes to your theological picture or metaphysical picture. But one of the things about Moltmann is that existential register for him is throughout his life is the one he encountered right when he, as a POW, and reads Mark's gospel. He has a brother in solidarity when he visits the concentration camp for the first time and has this vision of God's eschatological hope. And so his intellectual wagering is a promissory one, but part of it is at the existential way, this is how I'm giving myself in the world. Like I'm putting myself here.
Good.
And that.
Okay, let's go with a personal dimension and let's stick with promissory wager. Or remember, we're not talking about pure fideism or pure rationalism. Leave those out. So we're talking about two different approaches to the promissory. And there is indeed a personal dimension, as well as it's being a core theological, methodological commitment that works its way out in doctrine after doctrine and so forth. And here's how I describe it. The particular question or theological discussion point where it's most vivid is the problem of evil. And there's a standpoint. It may be a psychological difference, but it definitely leads to theological differences. The one individual says, I don't know, this evil looks very dark. It seems like not something that God under any framework could allow, and if God controls this, causes this, then that would be a problem of evil I couldn't take in. So I believe that in the end, we will recognize that this is, in fact, consistent with the nature of God, and that God has redeemed the evil in such a way that God does not remain guilty at the end. I can't give you the article right now. I can't prove it, but I think that's my commitment. There are another group of people who say, I cannot have faith that somehow it will just all work out if my theology doesn't, my way of thinking about it doesn't give some pathway to understand that reconciliation. If it is just, hey, I hope, then when my atheist friend asks me the question, well, the problem of evil really falsifies your God belief, I'm on their side. And that may be a psychological difference, but it's definitely a difference in theological positions. And again, is the contrast between you and Tabord, for example.
And say a bit about that just in you and Stephen Knapp's work, how kind of the conversations that between Moltmann and Pannenberg end up shaping the way y'all develop a critical form of making faith a minimalist account of doctrine, that, or even like, the article Metaphysics Under the Guise of Hope, which is how do you negotiate that tension as when you do constructive theology?
So most simply, what Knapp and I have done is to see two registers, like an x-axis and a y-axis. There's what we affirm and there's how we affirm it. So some people, if you only can change what you affirm and you see evil that seems to be unresolved, then you say, then I won't affirm that God has this controlling power, and I'll take a strong process view. God is doing the best that God can, but there's just limits to what you can do, even if you're a God, right? And that changing of the proposition, think of that as the y-axis, is something that we see often in theology, or parts of Catherine Keller's work, or many other guests that you've had on your shows. But for the y-axis is what's the manner in which you make this assertion. And we believe that only if you consider that two-dimensional space, rather than just let's change our propositions, or it's all subjective, what's your subjectivity along this line, but rather let's think of that two-dimensional space. So for example, eschatology, a final reconciliation, remains a part of theology for Steve Knapp and me. But in this new book that's just about to come out, I hope from Oxford, Hope Beyond Belief, we think of the ways in which the traditional propositions move on a scale from the epistemic, that is, I think I have really good reasons to affirm this, to the elpedic, from the Greek word for hope. And on the elpedic dimension, I have reasons to hope this. I find myself hoping this. I couldn't be the person that I am if I didn't hope this thing. And for that, all you need is the deep desire that it's to be true. It has to be at least plausible. It can't just be made up or a contradiction. You can't really hope a contradiction. I hope I'm going to step out of this room and fly home by waving my arms. And it has to be lived in religious faith. So it has to be a core commitment of how I live in the world. And I think that there lies a way to avoid the bad faith of affirming something we hope God will do, but we have no way of conceiving it now, on the one hand, or cutting my statements about God so far as, frankly, to become uninteresting because I can't solve philosophical objections on the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really helpful, that kind of the how axis in relationship to confidence, kind of confidence meter, and the what for the proposition side. And I think back to a conversation that was on the podcast, well, long time ago, with you and Catherine Tanner, who were both at Yale together. And she had written, I think this is the title of it. We were reading it in class, but we had read Christ the Key, which, if you want to hear what the sweetest interpretation of Luther, hooked with the Cappadocians, brought together with an eye towards theological ethics in the present, sounds like, turned up to 11. It's a beautiful,
just brilliant,
a beautiful text. Brilliant. And then there's the, but when you think of like the what, the propositions, it's a very confessional,
absolutely,
text. But then the how, at the beginning of that book and in some of her other books, you see this kind of like dialing back of what theological language is. Or she wrote the article like an eschatology without an end. And such. And so how would you kind of contrast that? Like, you don't have to like just use her, but like that kind of temptation in modern theology, how would you contrast those positions when you think of what the kind of wager for the idea of God that Moltmann's been driven by, like when you see in hope, in Theology of Hope and Crucified God?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's an authenticity when you take the what and the how question and you carry on that discussion with people outside of your echo chamber, outside of your bubble. I think that there's a drive toward those broader discussions that all of your work through Homebrewed and many forums manifests, that is becoming less and less common. As a culture, we seem more and more happy to talk to a smaller number of people who just agree with us. That's true of the American political situation today. It doesn't even need to be demonstrated. But sadly, it's true in theology, and that we are into a number of schools, and there are principles for entry. If you don't share the assumptions at the beginning, you're not a bona fide part of the discussion. Homebrewed has never done that, and I appreciate that very much about it. In that broader context, we receive feedback that involves disagreement. We are aware that there are competing perspectives, and we acknowledge them, and we acknowledge that we don't just have an easy answer to them. That is where I would locate Moltmann, and it's the highest word of praise I could give. He was never afraid to be in a room of people with different views. The Pentecostal theologians that he was a mentor to and a participant with held conservative theological views far to the right of his, and he never pulled back from those discussions. Many of the liberation theologians were moving toward a straight Marxism, and it never made him to be absent. It made a certain head of the Congregation of Faith apoplectic, but it did not make Moltmann get him worked up. And even where and this is maybe a weakness, but also a word of praise here as we're coming toward the end of this discussion, where he was involved with highly rigorous systematic thinkers. So Pannenberg, other people further to his theological right, process thinkers that he encountered, including the brilliant young Catherine Keller in Claremont in the late 1970s on his left. There was no fear about engaging in those conversations. And that way, Moltmann is like John Cobb. who has no fear of difference and just sort of embraces it and continues to affirm. And always he was the theologian that you and I have discussed and described in this conversation, a theologian recognizing the injustices of this world, the uncertainties, the multiple intellectual tides that could, like the winds that blow in every direction, like that Second Timothy, and at the same time kept his eyes on the prize, which is that hoped for reconciliation in the eschaton.
It's what you sent a whole list of quotes from Moltmann, and mine was quite as long. So I wonder if there's a, like, thinking of a way of wrapping up, if there's a particular passage from your selection that might function as a bit of a provocation as we conclude. So
I'll start with one, and we'll see where you go with it. I have several. In Moltmann's position, this is from Crucified God. The word God is not another nature or a heavenly person or a moral authority. I love this, but in fact, an event. Boom. However, it is not the event of co-humanity, but the event of Golgotha, the event of the love of the Son and the grief of the Father, from which the Spirit who opens up the future and creates life, in fact, derives. I'll stop there for a moment, see where you want to go.
Oh, no, yeah, they're like, I'm amazed how much of his energy gets translated well.
Yeah. Well, Margaret Cole was brilliant, and let that be said out loud. We owe so much to her. Nick sentence?
Yeah.
In that case, so he's now, we're in Garden of Gethsemane, not by word, but by illusion. In this case, or in this place, one does not simply pray to God as a heavenly thou, Martin Buber, but prays in God. One does not pray to an event, but in this event, namely, Moltmann would say, the event of death and resurrection. One prays through the Son to the Father in the Spirit. In the brotherhood of Jesus, the person who prays has access, pardon the sexist language, access to the fatherhood of the Father and to the Spirit of hope, two of his books in one sentence. Only in this way does the character of Christian prayer, and I'd add Christian faith and Christian life, become clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that addition there's, like, what he ends up doing. That's after the first two books, people don't spend as much time in his ecclesiology, but that's exactly what happens in it. And if people haven't read that, they all should, because it's easily my most footnoted one. The role, like, because it describes what happens in that Trinitarian life. You had sent me these before, and I found where in Trinity and the Kingdom of God, he describes how this Trinitarian experience shapes God's life in relationship to history. And this is where that kind of eschatological panentheism pops up. He says he's been going through he's like rehearsing this argument, and then he says, just as God goes out of himself through what he does, giving his world his own impress, so his world puts its impress on God too, through its reactions, its reverberations, its own initiatives. This can be seen no more clearly than the experience on Golgotha. It certainly does not do so in the same way, the contrast between God and the world. But that it does so in its own way, there can be no doubt at all. If God is love, then he does not merely emanate, flow out of himself. He also expects and needs love. His world is intended to be his home. He desires to dwell in it. Right. And so you get that promissory panentheism. And you could see that the like why I think it's eschatological panentheism. It's not a metaphysical one.
Absolutely. And that was recognized soon after the creation book came out. What's also beautiful about that is we're back to an event, and we're dwelling in an eschatological event, even though it's promissory. It's both present now and also that thing that we long for. Actually, there's another quote from Crucified God that's very similar to that. So let's see where it takes you. By the secular cross on Golgotha, we pietize the cross too often. And just think about that phrase. By the secular cross on Golgotha, understood as open vulnerability and as the love of God for loveless and unloved, dehumanized persons. So by the secular cross, God's being and God's life is open to true humanity. There is no outside the gate with God. I love that phrase. There is no outside the gate with God. If God, God's self, is the one who died outside the gate on Golgotha for those who are outside.
Mm-hmm. There's no outside the gate.
Yeah, because God's action is outside the gate for those who are outside.
It's beautiful. This is what I'm saying,
like,
Phil. Every time I spend time with him, I'm gonna be walking around with it. My Trinity dial is gonna get dialed up for a couple weeks here, and because we might be able to say some cool things metaphysically, but it just doesn't sound the same when there's no outside the gate with God.
Yeah. It's interesting that sentence comes at the end of a long paragraph, which is about Trinity, the event of the love of the Son and the grief of the Father, an event between God and God, an event within the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we perceive the liberating word of love, which creates new life.
Yeah.
So yeah, that completely supports your interpretation of there is no outside the gate.
Do you think that you want to say a bit like in the context of crucified God by what he means by the secular cross on Golgotha? I mean, we've hinted at like his conversations with a number of Jewish atheist theologians,
Yeah.
and then he also has that. He also has a rather unique reading of the kind of secularization thesis and such going on. But the
Takes me
secular
in a
cross
slightly
on
different
Golgotha.
direction. So for both Moltmann and Pannenberg in these years, there's a pushing back against salvation history, right? And is part of their distancing themselves from Barth, but it also had to do with New Testament scholarship, the great scholars of the late 1950s, which were opening up the New Testament in amazing ways. And both of them make the shift to a more universal history. Pannenberg as a theoretical concept, and Moltmann as the location for prophetic speaking and acting, right? Because universal history is a place dominated by injustice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But both of them find within that space a focus on the divine. In fact, God is large enough to encompass, to wrap up, to hold within the divine self that entire history. Something that Orthodoxy had often said. I mean, God could not be present to evil without being corrupted, was a standard theological statement. The difference between them is that Pannenberg tells us theoretically how to do that, and Moltmann shows us as a thinking person of faith how to do it in action, ministry, and prophecy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm gonna try to decide which of these lines to cut out so it's not long. But see, this is my Church and the Power of the Spirit volume, which I've had to glue back together and can't open the whole way. But in the end of the first third, he has this chapter called "In the Friendship of Jesus," and this is what that kind of participation in the triune life is, what the gift of possibility and grace moment to moment looks like, and it is the radical resistance to the hierarchy of the church taking place in it is grounded in the actual practice of Jesus enacting the kingdom in this section. And he says, friendship is an unpretentious relationship, for a friend is not an official term, a title of honor, or a function. It is a personal designation. Friendship unites affection with respect. And so then he goes on to talk about how friendship functions in the life of Jesus. And he says, when the people denounce Jesus by calling him the friend of tax collectors and sinners, they're expressing a profound truth from Jesus' own point of view. As a friend, Jesus offers the unlovable, the friendship of God. And he has this beautiful rendering, right, of Jesus saying, I no longer call you servants, but friends.
Yeah.
And I in this ecclesiology book I was working on with Frank Tupper, who's my master's advisor before he passed, which was basically like what Process and Moltmann would do if they wrote an ecclesiology. We do this whole riff on this, and say that, like, the invitation to thematize what God's love looks like in history that Jesus gives is one where the God who is love is an abstract statement of, I no longer call you servants, but friends. Right? That it's not that the invitation of God is one where all are friends of God, and the offense of the gospel is precisely that that friendship is being proclaimed. And Moltmann insists, he goes, and this is not something that happened because people responded to him. He enacted it, and they responded. That he had the authority, and the authority element, right, in Jesus is enacting the friendship of God, and the resistance people have is resisting that Jesus is enacting God belovedness on the sinner and the tax collector, and so when we think of, like, I have this bit about the crescendo of the New Testament, unlike Jungel says it's when, and John says God is love. But if you want to know what that looks like, it's when Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but friends. And he said, for the disciples, they experience him as a friend in his innermost being. It is true that there's no equality in divine friendship revealed through Jesus' friendship, for it is precisely the distinction between God and the world. But it is indeed a relationship of mutual friendship nonetheless, one that makes all hierarchies fear because of its uncanny, genuine nearness. If God is experienced as a friend, then man can become friends with God. Friendship becomes their bond of fellowship, and it is God's promissory note to enemy and neighbor alike. Oh, you're just like, come on, Multi. This is what I'm talking about. And so at the end of this friendship thing and thinking about the church, he says that the eschatological image of the church and how it's practiced should be an open fellowship. And I'm going to read this. And since you are a Quaker, you can tell us just how, why he does this whole, how he does his little asides, and it's a description of Quakers and fellowship of friends. And he ends it by saying, the Quakers who call themselves a society of friends show this in exemplary fashion through their open social work in the slums and their struggle for the abolition of slavery. Nothing is nearer the kingdom than open and total friendship that goes out to meet the other. That is the spirit of the kingdom in which God comes to man and man to man. Ambrose to Augustine, from Augustine to Aquinas, they hesitate at embracing this. Christian love has continually given the name friendship. They get that right, for love is the friendship of man with God and all God's creatures. In this inclusive sense of friendship, friendship really is the most righteous of all. Open friendships prepares the ground for a friendly world, our future.
That strikes. Those are powerful words for anyone in any tradition, but for me personally, in particular, in the Quaker, Christians call each other friend, but not just co-religionists. So all persons are friends, right? We are, because the love of God is universally given out, all are called to friendship. It also is deeply personal because, I mean, it's the nature of ministry in Quakerism, to be friends, not to go to objects of ministry, but they have to be fully friends. It's personal because a Quaker woman who's a wise influence on my life passed just a few months ago. And in the last days of her life, she said, at my memorial service, after the manner of friends, which means all people sit together and people speak out of the silence as they're led to honor the person who's passed. She said, I want you to conclude that service by reading John 14 and 15, actually, she said. You choose what you think expresses the spirit, using only the words in the text, but what expresses the core spirit of those 2 chapters, and that's very fresh in my memory. And what I'd say where it takes all of us is that in Christianity, I'm thinking of C.S. Lewis's Four Loves book. We're so quick to go to agape. Hey, I've got to really love in the agapistic way. And we downgrade friendship in the opposite way from what Moltmann just did. And frankly, if you can't love philea, if you can't love in that the friendship love, you don't have a clue what agape is. Agape incarnated is friendship.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love the friendship section. When I get just thinking about reading it last night, because I knew I wanted to reread it and try to figure out how I would pull a few clips out and set you up to talk about Quaker and friendship stuff. I'm like, this is the end. And you know why I picked it is like when you look at the responses to Moltmann all over, it is people who were his friends, and they're celebrating a theologian. They're celebrating brilliant things, but they're his friends. If you look at the two conclusion moments in his career, he writes experiences in theology, and he talks about how all this friendship of relationships had come out of all the attention he got with theology of hope and the crucified God, and he tells you how these friendships changed him. Friendships with the body of Christ across all lines of difference. And then in his autobiography at the end, he does the same. And you see that the life of this Christian theologian is one who took seriously that he understands that vocation in relationship with friends. And you can see here, right at the book that finishes his first trilogy, the Ecclesiology, that he goes like, that's what Jesus did. Jesus wasn't the Christ alone. He was the Christ with friends. They were called the disciples, and that group grew. And that group's growing to the eschaton. And so the idea of being a theologian, being one that takes the friendships as seriously as you take anything else, because God no longer calls us servants and has refused to call us enemies, but calls us friends. And that open fellowship of friends is something that is difficult and hard to figure out. Vulnerability. How do you stay in relationship across difference, disagreement, and all that kind of stuff? But that is the very place that the coming of God's kingdom meets us in the materiality of relations. And he was someone that paints it beautifully in the Christian tradition. And those of us that have very big process ties, he also webbed all of creation into this web of relations. He starts to recognize increasingly through his life, because of friends, the challenges of systemic and institutional evil in new ways. He changed his mind because friends, students, and enemies pushed him. And so as much as like celebrating his life and thought, and then bringing up these ideas that have shaped it, and then like our own interloctions, I think to me that friendship at the heart of it, both in his telling of the gospel story and at the heart of his practice, is where you see why he's so compelling to many. Is there is an integrity to it, and that to me is something, I hope there's at least two people that could say something like that when I croak. And that's something everyone, you don't have to be a nerd, you don't have to be a theologian to pick up, because the coming of the kingdom of God can meet you in the face of your friend and how you show up for them. And anyway.
Absolutely. It's so sad that in English we say, oh, we're only friends, we're just friends. Think of what a high bar friendship is. Imagine we were friends with our family members. Much higher bar than we currently hold. Imagine we were friends with our co-religionists, members of our congregation. A huge bar. We seem to be sworn enemies in many congregations, right? Imagine we were friends with non-co-religionists. So if you're Christian, with Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and Confucians. Imagine we were friends with God.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to call you friend, Phil.
You too. I
called you all sorts of other things. Some of them
behind my back
on the internet. Behind your back, I say nicer things.
Yeah, right. This is true. Yeah, you've never been shy. Yeah, but friends can speak honestly. That's another beauty of this term. Mm-hmm. Friends exist in honesty with each other. We fought today, and I've called you for a knockdown, battle at some point in friendship.
Well, there are a few people I will enjoy having a knockdown battle with, and I just really hope that whoever makes the odds recognizes just just the asymmetrical battle that's taking place. The only way would be a good home field advantage at a homebrewed event after they've been drinking. That's the only chance
Fair
I
enough.
got, Phil.
On your own home turf, then it's not going to be in the Harvard theology room where I would be most at home or whatever. Yep, you got it. It's public.
All right.
Yeah, I see it in the chat.
All righty. Thank you all for joining us. I will post this and some of the quotes and stuff Phil and I mentioned and things like that all along with it, and link to a number of the different tributes to him so you can go read it and such, along with like the interviews and things with Moltmann and people talking about him and stuff, because if especially for those that may not have spent much time with him, hopefully at the end of this you get lured to try to pick up Crucified God if you haven't, and if you can get through just the first chapter and your Christology is not a little bit higher, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. It's dangerous, Phil.
I think they're going to accept your challenge.
All right.
Hey, this was great friendship. Thank you. And I hope brought some light.